What's up, folks? I'm Chris, your NFL writer here at Occupy Fantasy, here with a look at this nice 10-game slate for Week 5 in the NFL on FanDuel and DraftKings. We have 6 games in the early window on Sunday, 4 games in the afternoon. Finally have some bye weeks kicking in here in Week 5, so we have some smaller slates to talk through, but the approach is still the same. We go through the biggest favorites on the board. We look at the running backs that are most likely to be in favorable game scripts, and those are the guys that we want to prioritize in our low-risk lineups, especially. And speaking of those criteria, David Montgomery stands out as my favorite play on this slate. You see that he's relatively affordable here this weekend. Montgomery has had 2 games where he's been fully healthy, left early in Week 2. So Week 1 and Week 4 played over 71% of offensive snaps in each of those games, has dominated all the rushing opportunities inside of the red zone. Montgomery has clearly been the featured back in this offense with high-value touches, and that is what we're most interested in daily fantasy. So sorry to all of the Jahmyr Gibbs truthers out there. I'm sure Jahmyr Gibbs' time is coming, but everything the Lions are telling us through their usage right now is that David Montgomery is the best running back to use on the Lions. And this week, with Detroit favored by 9.5 points against the Carolina Panthers, who are the worst rushing defense in the NFL right now, David Montgomery, the clear best play to fit into as many lineups as possible in DFS. We have one other team that is favored by a lot of points this weekend. It's the Miami Dolphins. They're favored by 11.5 in their matchup with the New York Giants, who have looked pretty poor on primetime the last couple of weeks. Thursday night against the San Francisco 49ers a couple weeks ago, and then this past Monday against the Seattle Seahawks. So why not the Miami Dolphins running back situation? And the field is finally deciding it is Devon Achane time. Achane projects to be one of the 3 most popular running backs on FanDuel and DraftKings this week. Dolphins have the 5th best run-blocking offensive line this year so far, based off of adjusted line yards, and we have a below-average defense from the New York Giants defending the run. Perfect storm of opportunity there for running back every single time we get that kind of matchup. One thing the Giants do well is they do defend the running backs pretty well in the passing game, so I would not expect much production through the air for these Dolphins backs. Now, in the 70-point Week 3 game, Achane here played 41% of offensive snaps. Raheem Mostert played 51% of snaps. Last week, we saw this actually flip. We saw Achane lead the Dolphins with 60% of offensive snaps, and Mostert played right around 40% of snaps in that game. So at this point, it does seem like Achane has flipped Raheem Mostert in terms of preferred usage for the Dolphins. The only wrinkle that you could throw in there is we had a negative game script, the Dolphins trailing by a ton of points against the Buffalo Bills, so maybe that is why we saw Achane more than Mostert, and there is at least the risk that we see more Mostert in a favorable game script than Devon Achane. But right now, I can tell you the field is on the side of Achane, and so therefore he is one of the better running backs to consider in low and high risk contests this week, especially with Miami being the biggest favorites on the board. Top on over to the Occupy model to look at some of the other running back spots that are going to be popular this week. I like to sort by, first, our DK and FanDuel OF index to see who's going to be popular. And once again, Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams getting basically all of the opportunities. We did see Ronnie Rivers mix in a little bit last week, but not a meaningful amount. Williams here projects to be the highest owned running back once again in DFS, right under 20% on DraftKings and FanDuel. The Rams are 4.5-point underdogs at this point. I'm recording this video on Thursday morning this week against the Eagles. Going to have to monitor Williams' status throughout the rest of the week here because he did miss practice on Wednesday with a hip issue, but we saw the upside last week. Williams had the most rushing attempts of his season thus far, a couple of touchdowns on the ground, a little bit of involvement in the passing game. That's the workload that we love to see, especially for a running back whose price is still super reasonable here at $6,700 on DraftKings and just $7,800 over on FanDuel. Now, the second most popular back on DraftKings, a little less popular on FanDuel because I think pricing will push people onto other plays, but DeAndre Swift of the Philadelphia Eagles is in the favorable game script here. He's clearly the lead back for the Philadelphia Eagles. We saw the rushing efficiency come back to earth last week against the Commanders, but he still got a high-value touch, scored a touchdown on the ground. Finally saw the targets tick up a little bit for DeAndre Swift, out touching the other running backs at a 2-to-1 basis here in this offense right now. Swift at $6,000 on DraftKings especially, a great play to consider in low-risk contests and in high-risk contests based off of where he ranks in the Occupy model this weekend. Already discussed Miami. Devin Achane is the third most popular running back in the model by projected ownership this week. We have Joe Mixon of the Cincinnati Bengals in a favorable game script environment on the road against the Arizona Cardinals. Bengals are favored by 3 points this week. There really is no meaningful third down back or RB2 that's getting usage in fantasy this year for the Bengals thus far. Joe Mixon has 82% of team carries over the last 3 weeks of play and 7% of team targets. When we come in here and we look at the raw numbers, obviously the Bengals playing in some negative game scripts and just not being super efficient on offense. We have not seen Mixon eclipse 20 carries yet. We haven't really seen the targets explode. Obviously 5 in each of the first 2 games of the season is pretty good. But the underlying metrics here, his usage in the offense as a whole, if Burrow is able to finally reach his level and get this offense humming, we should see Mixon's touches and opportunities go up alongside that. And this might be the week for that against the Arizona Cardinals. So Mixon, another running back that's in a really good spot to succeed here. One of my favorite high-risk running backs on the week is going to be Kansas City's Isaiah Pacheco, projecting for just 12% ownership right now. This will be one of the last games that goes off in the model. We saw him as the optimal captain in Showdown on Sunday Night Football against the New York Jets last weekend. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is playing a little bit for the Chiefs, but Pacheco is clearly the man in this backfield. And at $5,700 here on the road against the Vikings, a really interesting pivot off of the passing game, which will be popular. Because the other thing that we like to talk about when we're previewing slates week in and week out here on this channel, betting market information, the totals this week. The Chiefs and the Vikings carry the highest total on the board at 53 points at this point. So we know that Kansas City and Minnesota is going to be one of the most popular game environments for stacks this week. Quarterback Patrick Mahomes is going to be one of the most popular quarterbacks in all contest types this week. Mahomes much more popular than Kirk Cousins. So I think the Cousins side here is a really interesting side to take in high-risk contests. But with this game carrying the highest total on the board, with the Chiefs being the favored side on the road, favorable environment in the Dome there in Minneapolis, we're going to go with Mahomes. We're going to go with his clear number 1 target, Travis Kelce. And on the Minnesota side, Justin Jefferson, the best play on the Vikings week in and week out. This is a really expensive game stack right here. We just have 41.33 per player remaining. It's going to be pretty tough to fit this in, but our job is to figure out how to make it work, right? In the Occupy model on defense, we have the Denver Broncos ranked number 1 on the slate. We have a true minimum price defense. The Giants, it's disgusting against the Miami Dolphins, who we really like this week, obviously. But this $2,000 punt should allow us to fit some more things into our lineups if we need to. Looking at where the field is going, the Tennessee Titans at $2,400 are going to be the most popular defense on this slate in their matchup with the Indianapolis Colts. So I think we can start by just locking them in here and seeing what it allows us to do with a build around this to make this fit. Let me go back and put in my favorite running backs, David Montgomery, and I will put Pacheco in here just for the salary argument. $3,300 per player remaining is super, super tough to make fit. Now at this point, popular defense, popular running back, another running back that's in a good spot to succeed, also happens to correlate with this game stack. Not a ton of salary left. How are we going to make it work? This is where we need to consult the underperforming wide receiver list. And we have 13 wide receivers for high-risk contests that are really, really strong this week. The first one, near the top of the salary table, admittedly, but we have Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. Olave with 28% of team targets over the last 3 weeks of play and 46% of team air yards, has scored 0 touchdowns in that time period. 406 total air yards for Olave, underperforming his expected touchdowns alone here by over 2 touchdowns. We are seeing NFL pass catchers score touchdowns on about 180 air yards per touchdown right now. Olave and the Saints offense especially underperforming through the air. Hopefully we get some regression this week against the New England Patriots. So Olave, 6,900 here on DraftKings, a great underperforming wide receiver to consider for high-risk lineups. We have another wide receiver on this list that's going to be popular in low-risk contests. It's Michael Pittman with the Indianapolis Colts. After not doing much last week, just 5 targets against the Rams, only hauling in one of those as a reception, he's flashing on the underperforming wide receiver list this weekend as a result. We look at the last 3 weeks of usage from Colts quarterbacks. Michael Pittman leads in target share, second in air yard share to Alec Pierce, who has just a super low volume downfield role. But we marry the opportunity between the targets and the air yards for Pittman, and we see that he is also underperforming considerably. No touchdowns over the last 3 weeks of play. Has 208 air yards, so he is underperforming his expected touchdowns as well by over 1 touchdown. So we expect a touchdown from Pittman at some point with that usage that he has been seeing, and this may be the week here against the Tennessee Titans. Now we have some repeats. Last week, DeAndre Hopkins came into the games underperforming. We've got him here once again. We saw the long bomb from Ryan Tannehill last week that was not able to be hauled in by Hopkins there. So yeah, he is still on the underperforming wide receiver list. And this makes both sides of Indianapolis and Tennessee kind of interesting with underperforming pass catchers that we can consider. There are 13 total underperforming wide receivers on the Occupy model this week. Highly encourage you to subscribe to the site, go over to the Occupy model wide receiver page, and use the drop-down menu to look at the underperforming wide receivers on the slate. We've got our underperforming wide receiver menu. You can click True here, and you'll see who all of them are this week. We need some of these cheap guys to get expensive stacks into our lineups this week. The best cheap plays in the model. These are wide receivers priced under $5,000 on DraftKings and around or under $6,000 on FanDuel. Calvin Austin from the Pittsburgh Steelers and Josh Downs from the Indianapolis Colts are going to be the best values on both sites that fit that criteria. Tyler Boyd and Marquise Brown, also both sides of Bengals and Cardinals on DraftKings. They're under the salary thresholds. We're looking here for cheap players, but some guys that could make that expensive Chiefs stack fit. Calvin Austin, really cheap here, has seen a tremendous role for the Steelers since the Deontay Johnson injury. He's one option. Tyler Boyd may end up being the favored play by all DFS players here in this salary range, especially because we're not expecting T. Higgins to be available with his rib injury. Just $4,500 here on DraftKings, and we've seen what Boyd can do in this offense for several years, so I don't think I need to go off ad nauseum on that here. But underpriced for an anticipated role where the target volume is going to go up, and he's already been seeing targets 9 and 7 over the last couple of weeks. Boyd, interesting. These two guys, by the way, Austin and Boyd, also 2 others of those 13 wide receivers on the underperforming wide receiver list this week. So they're cheap wide receivers that project for a lot of targets. They've also been underperforming their opportunities. Great week to deploy these guys in daily fantasy, in my opinion. All right, been getting ahead of myself a little bit. I'm excited about high risk. Talked about Chiefs, Vikings, talked about some of the underperforming wide receivers. You're looking for how to finish off your low risk lineup, right? So we're going to use one of these guys here that's cheap at wide receiver in Boyd. We're going to get Montgomery back in there. We're going to get DeAndre Swift in there because of game script reasons. Quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, high total game against the Minnesota Vikings. He's going to be popular. Tua, biggest favorite against the Giants. High team total for the Dolphins. Dolphins actually have the highest implied team total on the board. Mahomes Chiefs have the second. Either of these guys viable in low-risk contests. I'm going to go with the points. I'm not going to overthink it here. Miami anticipating 29.75 points in betting markets this week. Tua, great option for low-risk contests. Once again, with his rushing production, Anthony Richardson going to be a great play to consider in low-risk contests. Just $100 cheaper than Tua, so I do think it makes the decision a lot closer than it has been for the first few weeks of the season. Richardson is now officially priced appropriately, but still a great play given his legs, given his upside in fantasy in full 4-quarter games, which we have only seen once thus far. It was an overtime game last week where he got 30 fantasy points. So we'd be happy to take 30 fantasy points at $7,000. He'd have to get closer to that $8,000 range for us to start really questioning the value there. But the other quarterback that's going to be popular in low risk, once again, Jalen Hurts from the Philadelphia Eagles. So these are the 4 guys that are going to be most popular this week. And there's no surprise that I like stacking the games that these guys are playing in this week. My favorite game stacks for high-risk contests are going to be the Eagles and the Rams here. It's going to be the Chiefs and the Vikings. Believe it or not, the other game stack that I'm interested in is the Lions and the Panthers. We have the Lions favored by 9.5 points, so I do think the Lions side is where we want to go here. But there is opportunity with a bringback on the Carolina side. Favorable game environment in the Dome. Adam Thielen's price still too cheap, I would say, for his opportunity with the Carolina Panthers. The wily old veteran here leads the team in opportunity in the passing game. 27% target share, 34% air yard share. Not underperforming because he has a couple of touchdowns mixed in there, but we're not going to argue with 8+ targets in each of the last 3 weeks for Adam Thielen. I would expect that to continue here against the Lions in what should be a negative game script for the Panthers, but positive for us with Adam Thielen in the passing game if they're chasing points, right? So Adam Thielen, I do think, is another guy who's low-risk viable this week, believe it or not. We already had a little bit of discussion in this video about the Titans' defense. 6,100 per player remaining. There's definitely a path to finishing off a low-risk lineup here. At the tight end position, Kelsey, expensive. That decision becomes very different week in and week out. Sam Laporta is the number 2 tight end in the model, projecting for under 10% ownership on all sites. I think this correlates pretty nicely with seeing the upside of the Lions in tournaments this week in that game. We have TJ Hawkinson on the other side of the Chiefs-Vikings game. Dalton Schultz at 2%, an interesting tournament play at an affordable salary. At tight end, the field is going to be on Kelsey. The field is also going to be on Dallas Goedert and chasing the volume with Zach Ertz. Ertz, I'll just slot him in here because he's going to be popular and cheap. We like that for upside. Obviously, in low risk, volume is king. 7,400 per player remaining. The wide receiver model, I talked ad nauseum here about the cheap guys. The best plays, Justin Jefferson's going to be number 1 in this model week in and week out the way that he's being used. Chris Olave with his underperforming wide receiver status, number 2 in the model, great tournament play. Puka Nacua, we are expecting to see Cooper Kupp return for the Rams in some capacity right now. He's back in practice. Don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I do think that makes Nacua somewhat more risky, especially at his now priced up tag here, 7,700 here on DraftKings, 8,000 over on FanDuel. Michael Pittman with the Colts is hanging around here at $6,400, and I think is going to be a play that the field considers in this salary range for low risk. And so when we get Pittman in here, we've got 8,400 remaining for the last player in our lineup. You can massage this a little bit. You go with Richardson over Tua, you can have an extra $100. I don't really know if it buys you much of anything. You can play a different defense, but this is the range of players that is going to be super usable in low risk this week. You're going to want to keep an eye out for the daily plug that we post on OccupyFantasy.com because we will have all of the best low-risk plays for FanDuel and DraftKings listed in there. Spend a little bit of time going over what's going to be popular so we can figure out where the pivots are in high-risk contests. So let's come off of some of these things here and see what we're able to do. Use the running back in your stack if you want here with it being such a large spread. I think that'll help you capture most of the offense. So let's stick with the ownership from the field and go with a Chan. We talked about Calvin Austin being an interesting cheap play at wide receiver. We have one of the cheaper tight ends that's going to be popular in Zach Ertz. Obviously, very doable to find usable lineups around a Dolphins no bring back 2-0 or 3-0. So if you don't want to use the running back, you can come in here and use one of the other ones we talked about in this video. Same amount of salary, basically left, right. So very doable with Miami, Rams, and Eagles. Hurts, true wide receiver 1, A.J. Brown. We have the ability. We obviously like Swift. We have Kyron as a popular running back that we can consider. Dallas Goedert is going to see a lot of ownership this week. This is doable, especially with those cheap wide receivers that I talked about a few minutes ago. Obviously, a little more uncertainty on the Rams side in the passing game with Nacua and Kupp. But if we just stick with what we've seen thus far this season, 58.66 per player remaining. Plenty of room to make something work with Rams and Eagles. I like the Detroit side quite a bit more than the Carolina side. But we can play Laporta. We can actually stack this and use it as a pivot off of the popular David Montgomery. We can use Adam Thielen as a bringback. 5,800 per player remaining. Obviously, plenty of running backs around that $6,000 range. Cheap wide receivers. I like this stack quite a bit. I think that is going to be different than the field this week. That's something that I'm going to be wrestling with as I look to prepare for Sunday afternoon. But Carolina, Detroit, I see the upside here with that. When I come up with my own game stacks, I'm looking at the ceiling from the three highest projected fantasy point players on each side of the game. Carolina, Detroit, my third highest ranked game on the main slate this week. Lots of things to consider here in week number 5 on this 10-game slate. David Montgomery, probably the best overall play for low and high risk contests in general. So, end the show right where we began it. I think Montgomery is the best player to put in your lineups this weekend. Daily Plug will be up by Friday evening, so make sure that you are subscribed to Occupy Fantasy. Make sure that you are in our Discord because you'll get notified the second that is posted with all of our top plays for Sunday's action. We will also have a plug for Sunday night football between the San Francisco 49ers and the Dallas Cowboys. That should be a really interesting game to play through, and I'm looking forward to reading what our team has for everybody in that. Brian will be back on Monday with a preview video and a plug for Monday Night Football between the Packers and the Raiders here in week number 5. Good luck on this slate, folks. I'll be back next week to walk you through week number 6 in the NFL.